Greetings and salutations. It's another day in the neighborhood, and you're listening to the Friday FARcast with Robert Phoenix. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Give yourself an even bigger round of applause. That's right, you're worth it. Just being here on Earth at this point in time in our collective history is worthy of a round of applause. Have we ever lived in a time that is the equal of the one we are currently living in now? Absolutely not. That is a clear and defined response. We've never lived in a time like this, period, end of story. I mean, the 60s were tumultuous. Some of you out there may remember them quite well. I was a wee lad, watching the 60s at home on my TV, my black and white TV. Watching the war come home every night. I was a wee lad. We sat around and we watched the war correspondence. It looked very dangerous. Indeed it did. Yeah, so, but it was, it was a tumultuous time, the 1960s. There was always something going on. There was always something happening. Felt like the world was ending. Helter skelter. Yeah, well, isn't that what Charlie Manson, also known as George Bush Jr., Little W. Have you seen those videos, those pictures of Manson and Bush? Not only do they look alike, they sound alike. I would love for some expert that has that spectrometer that matches voice prints. I'd love for that voice print to be matched up against George Bush. That'd be real interesting now, wouldn't it? But helter skelter it's the plan, right? I mean, we are living in the era of helter skelter. It's right out of the Charlie Manson playbook. What he was trying to do during that time, during the 1960s, theoretically. And there are people like Miles Mathis and other folks who think it was all just a sham, that nobody ever died really at I guess it was, where was it? La Cienega? No. It was the house where Roman Polanski, I believe, lived, if I'm not mistaken. And then you had Abigail Folger. She was there, and it was. Man, I'm having the senior moment on the Manson period, but that was the plan. The plan was to create this scenario where whites were being killed by blacks. Sharon Tate, thank you. The Tate LaBianca murders, thank you. So the plan was to create a scenario where there were whites being brutally murdered, and those murders were going to be blamed on blacks. And then what would happen is that theoretically enough of these events would occur, and then it would spark a race riot. This is what Charles Manson called helter skelter, that this was the plan. And he was involved in that plan. So if we look at what we're seeing today, we're seeing sort of this replay of the 60s in some ways, because we have this, I'm not sure if we would call it social consciousness. I'm not sure about that, because you know what was happening during the 60s, that I'm not rhapsodizing about something that happened a long time ago that in my rearview mirror looks better, because the 60s were pretty messed up in a lot of ways. But what you had in the 60s was this kind of equal parts of consciousness kind of opening that was going on at that time. And then you had this radicalization of a culture. And the two were, in some ways, kind of intoxicating to some degree. I mean, and they were sort of symbiotic, too. Like, you could look around and say the world is going to shit. And a lot of people did. A lot of people thought that the world was really going to end because we were on the edge of pressing buttons to go at Russia and go full nuclear with Russia. Vietnam could have been one of those hot spots. Vietnam was an active Korea. I mean, there was an actual war being fought there. That was going on all the time. You had groups like the Weathermen, and you had, of course, the Black Panthers, and any number of radicalized groups here, a lot of whom were infiltrated. We know that the Panthers were infiltrated. Eldridge Cleaver worked for the CIA. It was all COINTELPRO stuff. Perhaps some of the Weather Underground. You had SDS, Students for Democratic Society, which was really just a radicalized leftist group that wanted to join forces with other groups to overthrow the government. And one of the key people inside the Weather Underground, of course, is Bill Ayers. Everybody knows this. Bill Ayers was the author of Barack Obama's first book. He never denied it. He's never denied that he wrote Dreams of My Father. Never. Never denied it. And Ayers and Obama had a very close relationship for a number of years, going all the way back to when Barack Obama was actually in college, visiting the Ayers home. And if you don't know the story is that there was a mail carrier who would deliver mail to the Ayers family, and it was mostly Mrs. Ayers, although every now and then he would see Mr. Ayers, and Mr. Ayers was very well off. The Ayers family were involved in the public utilities of Chicago. They made a lot of money. He was like helping run the public utilities in the city of Chicago. That job pays pretty handsomely, and you get a lot of perks to go along with it. But Mr. Ayers, the elder, was also a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, because when this mail carrier would come around, when he would see Mr. Ayers on occasion, he would ask him about how he felt about his job and his working conditions and whether he felt that he was oppressed. And the mail carrier said, "No, I like my job fine, thank you." But Mrs. Ayers waxed poetically about a young man who she thought was just fantastic, and that they were hosting him, and that she thought that someday that he would be the President of the United States. She went on and on and on about this young man, and he happened to be there one day while he was dropping the mail off, and lo and behold, it was Barack Obama, young Barack Obama. A guy talked to him, and he said that he seemed very indifferent. He seemed very indifferent, like he didn't want to have anything to do with him, the mailman, preoccupied. So we can see that if you buy into that story, and there's a lot of stories out there. It's out there. You can go search on the internet. I'm not making it up. But I believe that that's probably the case. And so the Ayers family has been involved in destabilization of this country for a number of years now. Ironically, one of the last places that Andrew Breitbart actually visited was having dinner at Bill Ayers' apartment. Can you believe that? Andrew Breitbart and Bill Ayers sitting down over a bowl of noodles at Ayers' swanky Chicago condo. So with the 60s, we had this kind of radicalized, sort of explosive version of America at that time. And if you go back and you read the Laurel Canyon by Dave McGowan makes a really good case that originally, if you look at the anti-war movement of the 60s, it was populated and kind of fronted by professors from colleges. You see, this is when professors from colleges actually stood for something other than the ridiculousness of identity politics and the enforcement of proper use of pronouns. They actually stood for something. They actually had some intellectual skin in the game or movement that was anti-war, and they carried a lot of clout. So in order to disrupt the professorial front and the intellectual front that was in opposition to the war, they needed to create a different kind of opposition. And that's when we had the Yippies and Jerry Rubin, who's now a futures trader. I think did Jerry Rubin die? I know Abby Hoffman passed away. Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, the Steal This Book. And then you have, of course, the Weather Underground, the Yippies, the Weather Underground, SDS, the Black Panthers, and a number of smaller groups all in collusion to stage an overthrow of the government. And if you go deep enough, you'll find that there are projects, government projects, MK Ultra being a part of that. MK Ultra wasn't just about turning people into mindless monarch slaves. MK Ultra was about the destabilization of the culture, the introduction of chaos, and the inception of something new. That was ultimately the role of MK Ultra. Yes, MK Ultra, and we're still kind of living in it, to be honest with you. I mean, look around. Excuse me. We still see the monarch slaves. We still see the destabilization of culture. MK Ultra may not have gone away. Maybe it's been renamed or reclassified to something else. So we're in this kind of a remake of the 60s in some ways, but it's a lot meaner. It's a lot meaner. It's a lot nastier. There's a lot more hate. There's a lot more venom. If you go back to the 60s, there was an antidote for all of this, and it was called love. And it wasn't really sort of the bullshit kind of love that, oh, it's love, 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 everything's love, love. There was a different kind of love, right? I mean, you had, whether you like them or not, you had the baby boomers, Pluto and Leo, and Leo, of course, represents the heart, right? So if you have a whole generation that's born with Pluto and Leo, the transformative aspect of the chart, which is Pluto, all preaching love, it's going to have some level of coherence. Like, it's going to be, at the very least, coming from a collective heart. Okay. Now, again, I'm not banging the drum for the boomers, and I'm not dissing them. I think that, you know, I went through a phase where I was pissed off at the boomers to some degree, and I wasn't really pissed off at them, kind of in general. I was pissed off at the sort of the leadership. You know, you had these spiritual leaders. You know who they are. And really all they wound up becoming was cash registers for themselves and soporifics for the rest of us. Because when there was really something going on, when there was really something going down, when we really, really, really had an opportunity to get at this thing, which is, for me, it was the 1990s, and it was during the Clinton era. We had a smattering of people waking up during the Bush era, a smattering. But Clinton comes along, and you know, he's this cool guy, and he plays saxophone, and yeah, he talks like this. You know, I just love these American people. I know, I got that picture of John, me and John F. Kennedy together. Isn't that great? Don't we look great together? Damn, those are some good times. Good times. I'm always having good times. So we had that guy, right? We had that guy. And people were kind of high on it. You know, we just had 4 years of Bush. And here's Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall. I mean, what president ever did that? No president ever did that. It was like, wow, he's on Arsenio Hall. Who's on Arsenio Hall? Check it out, man. He's playing the saxophone. That guy's cool. Then there was Hillary. Do I have a sound effect for Hillary? Hillary alert. That's not really a good one. How about this? That's Hillary. Ooh. And the storm came, didn't it? It sure did. Waco. Elian Gonzalez. All that anti-patriot stuff. We had Randy Weaver. Yep. up in Idaho. We had the Freemen. Some of this stuff was going on during the Clinton era. People were trying to unplug. The problem is that there was still way too much cocaine out there. A lot of it really cheap, a lot of it crack. And getting into people's systems. And there was a lot of money. There was a lot of free money during that. Clinton era was quite prosperous. Led all the way into the .com era, which I talked about on the last show. By the way, I apologize for not showing up yesterday. I had some kid stuff I had to deal with. And I also wasn't feeling great, to be honest with you. I had family duties, and I'm going through this kind of body change thing. I'm changing my diet and trying to do different things, and when you do that, all of a sudden things happen in your body. You're not feeding these little beasts what they're used to getting, and so then they start to rebel and kick up a storm. So, but we go back to the '60s, and there was this sense of love, and there was also an explosion of consciousness, and we had, whether you like it or not, or dig it or not, or believe it or not. Dig it. It's a really 60s kind of thing. I don't know if you dig it, man, but these new teachings coming from the East. We got some wise people showing up on the shores, bringing us some ancient knowledge. It's going to transcend your life, if you know what I'm saying. But that's what was happening. You had people like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Crazy wisdom. He was here, and Alan Watt was here, and we had the last vestiges of Paramahansa Yogananda. We had his spiritual descendants. We had Swami Muktananda out there in the west coast, California, sleeping with his people, even though he told everybody else that you really need to be abstinent. You want to hold on to your chi. You don't want to disperse your chi. Everybody here needs to be abstinent, except for me, of course. When they found out there was a tunnel that went between Muktananda's room and another part of the ashram, people were shocked. I'm not. But there was that explosion of consciousness that was taking place at that time. So there was a kind of an opt-out. There was an opt-out. And even due to the fact that, if you go back to the 60s, there was a lot of the United States that still wasn't developed yet. Cities were much smaller than they are today. And land was cheaper. You just look at the Eternal Brotherhood, the Eternal Brotherhood of Love. Hold on a second. The Eternal Brotherhood, Sunshine, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. There we go. Thank you. You look at those guys, and those guys were the ones that created probably about 80% of the LSD in the 1960s and 70s. And they went up into the hills in Southern California and bought themselves a church and started their own commune and their own community. You could do that then. I've talked about that before. You could do that. So here you had these kind of end time scenarios in a lot of ways of the 1960s. And it felt that way. And you had some of the elements that are happening now. Certainly the country was divided against one another. Old versus young, man versus woman. To some extent black versus white. But it's nothing like it is today, trust me. And to some degree even left versus right, but it's nothing like it is today. So we had this division, but there was also outs, right? Like if you play poker, you have outs with cards. There were outs. You could say, oh, well, this world really sucks. I'm going to get into the spiritual trip. And I'm just going to find my center. I'm going to find myself. I'm going to find other people. And maybe we'll go get a place on the land and we'll prepare. And then what happens is, some of those people actually did pretty well. There were communities that came up with products and product lines. And some of those communities prospered. And people came out of some of those communities with products that went from alternative to mainstream. So that's a difference between then and now. Now it's a lot different. Number one, we have just, the spectra of technology is nothing like it was then. I mean, you had transistor radios and AM stations, right? And now we've got the looming presence of the 5G network and killer towers. And we have the Internet of Things, where your appliances will talk with one another and then talk to the cloud and pass along information to the cloud about everything that you do. Or they can shut your appliances off at any point in time, or they could, who knows, maybe they'll amplify your appliances and create an electrical field inside of your house that can destabilize you. I mean, it's nightmarish, right, to think of it, but this is the 5G network, and it is coming online. Didn't have that in the 1960s, wasn't even close. And I'm not saying it was better. I'm just telling you that in a time like this, there were more outs. And there was a different level of consciousness. It was like two tracks. There was a disassociation and a deconstruction, and then there was kind of something new and different. Now, part of that something new and different was also part of the plan as well. To move people away from this kind of family-centric, nuclear home, right? This was the plan. It's like, let's get them out into the land. Let's break up the family. Let's get them into communes. Let's insert these various religions from other places into their minds so we can begin to deconstruct Christianity. I mean, some of that is in there too. That's all part of it. But life is interesting. Life is interesting, and just because some of these programs are inserted doesn't necessarily mean that they achieve what they set out to do, because a lot of people got really switched on during that time. And there are people that have come back around from that period and rededicated themselves to a life in Christ, or a deeper relationship with God, and so these things happen. And there are people who get lost too, as well. You get lost on the wayside. I took this new supplement that I made today, and I'm kind of wired, I have to say. So I have to slow down a bit, just a little bit. But here we are, we're in this time, and it's it's mind-blowing. And it's not easy. Boy, it is not easy to be alive right now, I'm telling you. If you are rabid, if you're on the rabid left, you're like a shark right now, and you're smelling blood. Now maybe it's an easy time for those people to be alive, because all of a sudden everything has been vindicated. Everything has been vindicated. You see, Trump is a racist. You see, everybody that follows Trump is a racist. And if they're not, they're a closet racist. And we're going to flush them out. We're going to figure them out. And you know what? If we see them at these rallies, they're going to get fired. We're going to turn them in. And when that happens, there's vindication there. People feel vindicated. And there's kind of not a better feeling in one's life than feeling vindicated. Am I right? I mean, it's a great feeling. You go from sort of non-validated until all of a sudden feeling validated and vindicated. It's like, yes, see, I knew all along. I knew all along. Yes. The only thing vindication does is it's a temporary removal from suffering. That's all it is. It's a temporary respite from suffering. It is not long-term. Vindication only lasts as long as the social condition associated is connected with it. That's it. And even at that point, it might wear off, and you might need another dose of vindication and validation. It's kind of like being born again, except maybe in the opposite direction. But it's not a long-term cure for suffering, because when it's all over, I guarantee you, the suffering will still be there. And to some degree, I mean, isn't what this is all about, this big exercise, this big phony bullshit, divide and conquer exercise. I mean, on the left, isn't it about, on some level, that we are going to remove suffering? If there is suffering in the world, we're going to do it. No matter how small the group is suffering, and they're being denied some access to whatever faded memory the American dream is. But that suffering is only really kind of set aside for a certain group of people. It's selective suffering. That's what it is. A lot of people like to use the word tolerance. Tolerance. Tolerance, 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 tolerance. Tolerance has its limits. Because within tolerance, there's intolerance. Right? Because if you don't tolerate something, or you're not engaged in the act of tolerance, then guess what? Then the people who define what tolerance is can become intolerant. And they won't tolerate your intolerance. They won't tolerate it. See, there's a limitation to tolerance. Tolerance has some level of approval associated with it. If you're approved of, then you are tolerated. You are tolerated by exhibiting a degree of tolerance, which are all within a social framework. Tolerance. But you go beyond that, and guess what happens? You get your wrist slapped. The bigger concept here is compassion. Compassion outranks tolerance. It's not even close. It's not even close. And we have lost touch with compassion. And we have lost touch with empathy. And right now we are in the shark tank. That's where it's at. We're in the shark tank. One of my favorite people over on Facebook is, I've talked about him before, Eddie Lynn. Eddie doesn't mind me using his name. I know he doesn't. First of all, Eddie is one of the most switched on people I've ever run across. And he had a very interesting method of going about doing it. He had a very difficult upbringing. I'll bring him on one of these days. Eddie's got a fascinating story. Really fascinating story about growing up on the Presidio in San Francisco. And there's a base underneath the Presidio. All the Army bases that they shut down, you know what they did with them? They moved them underground. They moved them. So those bases are still there. When they were shutting down those bases in the 90s. They're still there. They're just not above ground. Not all of them, but a good number of them. So Eddie lived on the Presidio, and he's got some interesting stories to tell about that. But eventually his life collapsed. He really was in a very difficult place, and that happens to people. It happens to people. So Eddie went to Mexico to do some healing work with some sacred medicines. We know what some of those are. And he turned his life around. He met somebody, he got married, he came back to the United States, he had kids, and he's a top-notch illustrator working on films, working on his own comic books, and delighting all of us over on Facebook with a lot of his really, really cool images and illustrations. He's a sci-fi guy. And so Eddie also has an ability to really get down and deconstruct things. He's amazing at it. And he's a pretty good investigator as a result of this. If you get into this stuff, you got to do some investigation. So he popped in on a thread that I had going on Facebook, and I want to bring this thread up here, what he has to say. Excuse me. This is interesting. Okay. So, the woman, the young woman who got theoretically killed during the Charlottesville massacre, is a woman by the name of Heather Heyer. Heyer. Heather Heyer. And Eddie posted this. He says, look at this LinkedIn profile. Heather Heyer's endorsements, who was supposedly killed in Charlottesville. Barely anything. 2 endorsements for each skill. And one of the endorsers is Susan Bro, her mother. She is all over the news giving speeches. Where have we seen that before? Where have we seen the speechifying before? We've seen it after events like Sandy Hook, Santa Barbara, Roanoke, Virginia. The speechifying is out in force. So she's doing that now. And again, I mean, my God, I mean, if you have a kid and they die in something like that, right? Is your first course of action to go out and hit the trail and start giving speeches? It's like Mark Kloss, Polly Kloss's dad, after she was abducted and then much later on, found dead. You know, Mark Kloss never, in my mind, ever showed one kind of moment of any kind of deep sadness or the inability to bring himself to terms with the fact that he lost his daughter. I never saw that from it. Now, look, I've done a lot of work on the Kloss stuff. You can go on my website and check it out. It's under the Stranger Things post that I've done. And, but it's just weird. It's just weird to see that. It's like, isn't there any downtime for grief? Don't you take some downtime and just try to understand what happened? I mean, that's what I would do. But that's just me. And I have a feeling that there would be other people like that. Let me continue to read what Eddie wrote. This is interesting. Now, her mother worked, or Heather worked, here we go. Heather worked for Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech is kind of like Langley Central for colleges. Like if there is a school that is associated with the CIA more than any other school, it's going to be Virginia Tech. Because it's in the backyard of Washington and the CIA and all the other alphabet agencies. And you remember when we had the big massacre at Virginia Tech? And that took place a month before Queen Elizabeth's visit for the 500th anniversary of Jamestown. Hello. So Eddie is saying that this is starting to look like a massive operation. And I have, look at that, the LinkedIn page has been taken down. You can no longer go to Heather Heyer's LinkedIn page. Interesting. So here we go. This is beginning to look like a pretty significant operation. And this is it. I mean, this is kind of like this Potemkin moment in some ways in the history of the United States. Because really what's at stake here is the overthrow of the country. And it's funny because I've seen people like Steve Pieczenik, who I actually like. He's a really bright guy. But if you'll ever listen to Steve Pieczenik, I'm showing you my Steve Pieczenik guy. Alex, you're always so bright. But you know, Alex, the deep state. Pieczenik says he's the deep state. He says he's the deep state. Like he's a really interesting guy, but I don't trust him at all. You know, this is a guy that can, dances back and forth between the light and the dark and who knows what else, man. But he's interesting to listen to. But he says, no. There's nothing here. There's nothing here. This is all just a distraction. I did like his description of Richard Spencer, though. He's a weasel. He's a weasel. He's a spoiled brat weasel. Never worked a day in his life. I've never dug Richard Spencer. I mean, he became the darling of, the alt-right, and he'd show up on Henrik Palmgren's show a lot. I never got into Richard Spencer. It's like, who is this guy? He had about as much charisma as a bowl of, I don't know, malto meal. There's nothing there. Anyway, but Pachenik is saying, don't worry about it. No, don't worry about it. And then the left is on the run. They're morally bankrupt. They have nothing left. I'm not sure. They may not have anything left as a party, but they're throwing all their resources at this destabilization. And they have the mainstream media backing them up. And even Fox News is moving more towards the left, because apparently Rupert Murdoch is not a fan of Trump's nationalism. These people want globalism. They want globalism, they want diversity, and this is the new plan. And so the media is behind it. When you have the media behind it, then, it's an easier sell in some ways. It's harder to push back against what's going on. And then you have deep pockets, the Soros pockets, and whoever else is funding this stuff. So I don't think it's just going to go away. I don't think it's a distraction. Although you notice that we're not talking about Russia anymore, are we? No. We're not talking about Debbie Wasserman Schultz either, are we? No. Do you think there's a reason for that? Yes, there is. Absolutely. Now, one of Mueller's guys quit. He quit the team. One of Mueller's bulldogs just got out of the way. And I'm not sure if he had a moment of conscience, if he was threatened. I don't know what it was, but they're down one. They're down one on the Mueller side. And I think, when is it, Thursday? This coming Thursday is when the first round of the depositions come out, if I'm not mistaken. Well, it's happening. I mean, we are seeing something significant. We're not. This is a very different time than the 1960s. Very different. I was watching TV yesterday, and John Henry, who's the owner of the Boston Red Sox, has now said that he would be more than happy to rename Yawkey Way. Yawkey Way is the street that is just outside of Fenway Park. There are vendors and people that sell food, and you go down Yawkey Way before the game, and it's kind of a carnival. And he wants to rename Yawkey Way, that's Y-A-W-K-E-Y, because the Red Sox were the last team to bring a black player onto their roster. So somehow he's linking Tom Yawkey, one of the previous owners of the Red Sox, as a racist. So they're going to rename that street. I don't give a shit. They can do whatever they want. I wonder if they're going to name it Pumpsie Green Way, because Pumpsie Green was the first black baseball player that played for the Red Sox. He was that guy. So if they're going to name it after somebody, it should be Pumpsie Green Way. Pumpsie Way? Greenway? Greenway? Because it's Yawkey Way, right? Greenway. Greenway. Doesn't sound really quite right, does it? Greenway. Pumpsie Greenway. I like that. So this is unprecedented. They're tearing down statue after statue. I'll tell you who they won't tear down, though. Is they won't tear down what's his name? Pike. Alexander Pike. Pike, the Confederate general. They won't tear his statue down, will they? No, because he is the founder of the Illuminati in the United States, super high-ranking Freemason, and also connected to the KKK. But he's so connected to Freemasonry, they'll never tear a statue down. Never. Never. I would absolutely love to see a coalition, a civil rights coalition, go after the Pike statue. See what happens. See how far you get with that. You won't get very far at all, I guarantee you. But it'd be fun to watch. Nonetheless, of course, here in Texas, we have the Alamo, which has been run by UNESCO now for, I don't know, just fairly recently. I think UNESCO has sort of the rights to the Alamo. And now they're talking about, hey, let's do something with the Alamo. Well, what are they going to do with the Alamo? The Texans lost. It's not like they pushed back and they crushed Santana's army. No, that didn't happen. They lost. And yet the loss was kind of this thing that spurred Sam Houston on to gather more people and come back and get another round. I don't know how you spin that. Maybe you could change history and say that they won at the Alamo. They won at the Alamo, and because they won at the Alamo, now they've got to tear it down. Maybe that's what they need to do. Completely change history. Talk about all the massive deaths that occurred and how the Texas Army dismembered people and hung their limbs from the oak trees out there. Tell that story, and then they could tear it down. Because apparently we're at a phase where history is being rewritten before our eyes. This is exactly what happened during the rise of the Bolsheviks. Remember, this is the 100th year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. This is it. The 100th year anniversary. This is when the Romanovs were killed. And remember, the Trumps are the new Romanovs in a lot of ways. So we're repeating that cycle as well. Interesting times, right? Sorry about that. Try to get the audio mix. And yet we are being called upon to transcend the duality. We're being called upon to rise above it. Because we know that this is a divide and conquer strategy. We know this. And we also know that there is an aggressive front that is engaged in some form of cultural and political subterfuge to overthrow the presidency and even the government of the United States. And if you think I'm paranoid, well, this insurgency has been happening ever since Trump got elected, but even before then the insurgency was on. It's been going on for a while, but this is a big part of it right now. So here we are, we're bearing witness to this. We're bearing witness to this. And so what would Jesus do? What would send on to do? Probably nothing. There would be some very profound and deep thoughts, shares, parables, and then there would be some form of forgiveness. Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do. Right? I mean, this is where that model goes. This is where it goes. If you want to rise above and transcend the duality, you just get out of the way and say, this is the Son of Man. This is the fallen world. This has nothing to do with my Father. This has nothing to do with the kingdom of heaven and life ever after. That's part of the strategy, part of the plan. The only problem with that is that a lot of people are going to, if that's the case, and you just lay down, a lot of people are going to get killed if we continue to go down this path. Because right now, if you look, This is where like a lot of the pundits, I think, kind of get this wrong. Like I was listening to Kevin Barrett, this guy from Veterans Today, and he was on Richie Allen's show, and I think Kevin Barrett's got it wrong. You know, he's trying to kind of low-key this thing. I don't think it's necessarily low-key because these people are not going to stop until they get what they want. And how are they going to get what they want? Blood or not, there is the agenda for a coup. And that's just the bottom line. And it's not just, you see, now it's no longer Trump. It's Trump and everybody associated with the right. Or everybody associated with saying, hey, I don't agree with this. I see this differently. Now all of a sudden you utter that and you're a racist, or you're a fascist, or you're a neo-Nazi, which is the worst form of identity politics ever. So we have to understand that these are the rules of engagement. And a lot of people just don't have any space for dialogue anymore. They just want to shoot you down, and then they're just living for a moment of vindication. That's it. That's it. So you got to know what you're involved with here. You have to know what you're involved with. Now, if you're on the left side and you say, okay, this is good, fine, great. You know, the heat is on. But here's what I have to say to people, both on the left and the right, is that if this goes down the way that worst case scenario goes down, there are no winners. There are no winners. Your moment of vindication will be short-lived. And that would be for both sides, by the way. There would be no winners. Because you know what happens after that? What happens after that is a totalitarian state. That's what happens after that. It's boots on the ground and boots on your neck. And the same cops and the same National Guard that stood down during Charlottesville, I guarantee you will not be standing down when it comes time to put those boots on the ground. It's not going to happen. So if there's a case where things go off the rails, if there's a case where all of a sudden somebody on the right, on the real right, not the fake right, really decides to fight back, or the left exacerbates things to the point where things are kind of getting out of control, and it could be another false flag, it could be Trump going to Phoenix on the 22nd, hello, the day after the eclipse. Is that a wise move? I'm not so sure. Interesting location. 33rd parallel. That's right. But what happens after this kind of chaotic concrescence? I'm telling you right now, there are no winners. There are no winners unless this thing gets into a prolonged 3 to 5 year civil war, which could possibly happen. Possibly. I'm not sure that people have the stomach for a civil war. I don't. Now here's the thing about rage. Once you expel the rage, there's nothing left. You know, if you're ever a kid, you know, and you got into a fight, you wanted to be the angry one first. And try to do as much damage when you were angry. Because once the anger was over, if that other person was still standing, you were kind of screwed. You had to deal with somebody who wasn't as angry as you, and you had to, you know, just tough it out at that point. And because now you're in a fight. So even people who have surface level rage, once that rage is dispelled, you're kind of screwed. Because there's nothing underneath that. Really what's underneath it is grief. But that's a much more complex emotional operation. And I don't think people really have any desire to get to grief. They just want to exploit their rage. But the totalitarian outcome is not good. Everybody loses. We lose our freedoms. We lose any of our constitutional rights under a suspension of the Constitution. We get continuity of government. You know, it is not a pretty sight. Not a pretty sight at all. this is where cities can get cordoned off. And I'm not trying to be a fearmonger. I'm just giving you the potential scenario of what happens if we wind up basically becoming sort of the marionettes of the people who are creating this scenario. Because it'll manifest exactly in sort of the way that they want to. And it doesn't matter if it's Trump or anybody else. This is what we'll have to deal with. These are really, really, really tricky times, precarious times. And then we've got the eclipse coming up. Man, that eclipse. Whew. What an intense kind of moment in American history. I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to the eclipse. It's scoring my ascendant. Who knows, man? Who knows what's going to happen to me during that eclipse? I might be broadcasting during that eclipse, I'll tell you that right now. Maybe I'll even travel north. Maybe see if I can get to, the other side of Dallas, get closer to it. Throw myself into the heart of the eclipse. Set your controls for the heart of the sun. Pink Floyd. I don't know how much more I have to add today, to be honest with you. We got 60 minutes here of sort of intense, concentrated, focused rumination. And the refrain that I'll just come back to is you just got to take care of yourself. This is where I am right now, trying to eradicate 10 years worth of sitting and working with people. Every time I do these broadcasts now, I'm standing up. When I work with people, I'm standing up. My back, I've got a compressed disc. I've got a ruptured disc. Man, it is not fun having to deal with this stuff. Waking up in the middle of your life and realizing, hey, I just thought I could just autopilot this thing all the way through. I've always been pretty athletic. I've always been able to regenerate. And the next thing I know, I wake up and my body feels like I'm about 75 or 80. And that's not fun. My mind, of course, is, it's pretty good, but getting this body thing back together, that's a major operation. And so we have to take care of ourselves, number one. That's first and foremost. If we can't take care of that, we've got nothing for other people. And I've come to realize this in a pretty significant way, unfortunately. But it is what it is, and it's where we are now. So where in your life you need to take care of things. Even the hard stuff is taking care of yourself. And taking care of yourself is, it's not always the easiest thing to do. Stepping away from a couple of margaritas a day to maybe one or two a week, it's not always easy to do that stuff. Changing your diet, it's challenging. Having to do exercises consistently to, make sure things are working. It takes work. Dealing with your finances, your debt, and this is all self-care stuff, boy, right now. But this is where it is. And you get up to speed, and you get up and running, and you understand that there are spiritual forces at work that are willing to help you. If you are as pure of heart and intent as possible, they're there. They're there to help you. The challenge is when you have some backlog, and you have to deal with the backlog. And eventually they show up and say, yeah, good work. We've been waiting for you. You put in the effort, didn't you? Well, that's what it is. It's putting in the effort and manifesting the fruits of that effort. And then you get to a point where things can be a little bit more effortless. These are tricky times now, and it takes all of our attention, and it takes all of our conscious awareness to really be as clear and as responsive in the moment as possible. And that's where it's at. All right, I'm going to leave you all today. This was a rich hour. Thank you for sharing it with me. I'll be back on Sunday night in the Pre-Eclipse show over on YouTube in the live stream. And I hope you will join me it'll be an interesting time. I might even do a live stream during the eclipse itself. We'll see if we could do some something crazy like doing a simulcast on Spreaker and live stream on YouTube. I think we can handle that now. All right, let's get on out of here. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Have a fantastic weekend as we zoom in on the eclipse. And I'll see you guys on Sunday night.